listening to the Compassion Fatigue podcast with your host, Jennifer Blau. This is session 45. Well, hello and welcome to the Compassion Fatigue podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today's topic is one that I've been wanting to cover for some time now, but I have been putting it off, if I'm completely honest, ever since my oldest dog, Henley, suddenly passed away on Labor Day of this year. But I realize it's a topic that really needs to be explored because unfortunately, it is so prevalent in both our personal and professional lives, and that is the topic of grief and loss. I'm really honored to have Cheri Barton Ross on the show today. Cheri is a writer and college professor who lives in Sonoma County, California, with her husband and children, both two-legged and four-legged. And Cheri is best known for her pioneering work in the field of human companion animal bonds and loss. Her books include Pet Loss and Human Emotion, A Guide to Recovery, Revised, and Pet Loss and Children, Establishing a Healthy Foundation. Both of those books can be found on my own bookshelf, by the way. Cheri's work has been included in textbooks for veterinary medical schools and psychology books, and in addition to presenting at many seminars for mental health professionals and veterinary medical professionals, both nationally and internationally, Cheri has authored and published numerous articles and books on the topic. Ross's work was used as supporting documentation to help pass legislation that was made into law, which allows for pets to be considered family members in a natural or man-made disaster, which came on the heels of Hurricane Katrina. Cheri is the founder and facilitator for one of the longest-running grief support groups in the United States, the Redwood Empire Veterinary Medical Association Pet Loss Support Group, which has been running since 1998. She has assisted in establishing similar support groups throughout the nation and abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cheri Barton Ross. Hi, Cheri. Thanks so much for joining us today on the Compassion Fatigue podcast. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me, Jennifer.
In case our audience doesn't know, I am a certified pet loss grief recovery specialist, and Cheri's work was actually very influential in my own career. So it's really an honor to have her here today. And she's going to be talking about a topic that I think is misunderstood, not given enough attention, yet is very prevalent in the animal welfare fields, and that is grief and loss. So, Cheri, I'd like to start out by asking you, what personally led you to the field of pet bereavement?
Okay, excellent question. It was a long time ago. I was in undergraduate school, and I took a part-time job at a veterinary medical practice. When I was working there, I worked up at the front counter, and I actually saw people, grieving the loss of their pets, anticipating the loss of their pets. They would take time and talk with me. But at that time, that was in the 80s, 1980s, a long time ago, I felt like there wasn't much support, and let alone even sometimes empathy for what people were going through. So that was kind of my first footstep into it. Later on, and a few years later in graduate school, I decided to do my master's thesis on human companion animal bonds. And at that time, I had a very close relationship with a pet, a rabbit, Wendell, who was very dependent on me. And he had a lot of medical issues, but I was very close to him. And on the night that I was supposed to present my thesis, he died. So it was really kind of, a very poignant and moment in my life and turning point. And shortly after that, I established a pet loss support group, which actually is still going, and it's one of the first ones in the United States, and it's one of the, of course, longest running.
That's amazing. When I first got into the field myself, it was also due to my own personal pet loss. And like you, I felt that there were not, I was living in Northern California at the time and I just couldn't find any resources. So I said, well, after I came out of my depression, I said, well, I guess I'll be a resource, went off to grad school and got the certification. And here we are today talking about this, this very, very important issue. And I don't think that, the general public realizes really how much grief is involved in animal work, so whether it's a shelter environment, vet hospital like you worked at, pet sitting, dog sitting, or even animal activism. Can you explain the impact of grief when it comes to animal loss?
Absolutely. I think, well, I'm in Northern California right now, and we recently just went through the fire disaster here in my area. And so there are a lot of rescue workers actually burying pets on people's property and placing crosses at this time so they can say goodbye to their pets. And then also, there was a group of people, or many groups, helping to rescue pets. And I got to be a part of that too, which is important work. But it also takes a toll. And I think one of the most poignant examples of that, and probably a turning point in our culture and how we really started to understand the importance of human companion animal bonds, was Hurricane Katrina. And I was writing a revised edition of my book, Pet Loss and Human Emotion, A Guide to Recovery, at that time. And I was watching all of this play out on the television, and you saw people for the first time, the rescue workers came in to try to help save their lives, refusing to go without their pets and taking a stand and saying, I would rather stay here in the floodwaters and die with my pet than to be rescued or evacuated without them. That was a turning point.
Yeah.
I think for, basically around the world, this was being played out and watched. And Dr. Pia Salk, she's Jonas Salk's niece, if you remember him, the polio vaccine founder and discoverer. She's a psychologist, and she worked a lot with doing rescue work. And she took a team into Louisiana, but they were not allowed to go in until 6 weeks after the initial flooding happened. And so that team witnessed a lot of horrific sights because of it. So a lot of death, of course, with the pets, but mostly the struggle that they saw that, had played out for these animals. And that was because people were used to evacuating, and they thought that they would come home in 2 or 3 days and they left enough food or water. But no one knew that the levees would break and that this would end up being, such a long, long process. And so these animals perished, and the rescue workers suffered greatly because of this. And Dr. Salk asked me and some other therapists to come to Washington, D.C. and help work with the rescue workers and deal with, some of them had post-traumatic stress because of what they witnessed, definite, depression and that around these losses. So, that's one profound example. When you get into animal care work, you usually do it because you love and respect and want to care for animals. And so your heart's in it. And as much as you try to protect your heart from this type of work, you do feel grief and loss. And I think, in the book especially, I was able to acknowledge that and talk about that. And I think that was one of the first times, we've had something published around that. Also, too, she took that work, she asked me for it before it was published, and she presented to the Louisiana State Legislature. And out of that came an act. And the act was passed to allow people to be evacuated with their pets and to have a safe place for their pets during evacuation. And we've seen state by state adopt similar acts and pass legislation regarding that. And so I got to witness it firsthand here during, the fire disaster that we went through in Sonoma and Marin counties. And so, very poignant example, and then of course this plays out in much smaller ways of just rescuing animals on a day-to-day basis, all the different organizations that do such great work for, animal care and that, and, we'll talk about zoos and forgotten felines and, the Humane Society, and just, those are just a few off the top of my head right there. But again, this plays out daily in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I work with animal caretakers, locally and across the country, and one theme or one concern, I guess, that comes up all the time is they say, we don't have time to grieve, to really process our feelings that are involved when we lose an animal that we're trying to protect. Or another theme that I hear is, well, I just don't go there, right? So I either don't have time or I'm not going to allow myself to go there. Why is it imperative that these workers do take the time and do make the space for grief?
Yeah, what you just said is very concerning when people say, I don't allow myself or I don't have time. Grief sneaks up on you. You're going to go through the process of grieving if you have heartfelt feelings. And so again, people who do this kind of work do it out of, love and care for animals. So those feelings are going to come up. They may take a person by surprise, at a time when they're not expecting it to happen. But it's a process and we all go through it. And I think you can only push it back, push it away for so long. And then eventually, it ends up at some point coming through. And when you go through the process, if you've kind of like an onion effect, it's layers upon layers upon layers. If you're not processing that, not going through that each layer, sometimes when you just get to a point where there's so many layers, it can be more complicated to go through the grieving process for people. And that in itself has its own challenges.
So, Cheri, do you think that part of that has to do with animal-related grief almost being a form of disenfranchised grief? And can you explain what that concept is?
Yeah, historically, pet loss has been an unrecognized loss. So when we say disenfranchised grief, we're talking about unrecognized losses. The most obvious ones, recognized losses being the loss of a person or, a heartfelt relationship. This does play a role in how we grieve today and how society responds to our grief around pet loss. It's so much better than when I first started. When I first started doing my research, there were only 2 books published on it in the world. And so I had to find a lot of unpublished papers of people studying it so I could write my master's thesis. And now today, you see it recognized in a Hallmark card, people talking about it on podcasts like yours, television shows, radio interviews. There's so many books out there for, and support groups and that. And so I see, so much hope in that. Bringing this type of loss to the forefront as being a universally recognized loss. Now, that being said, many people who have not been blessed to have been loved by, experienced loved with an animal, or if you want to say loved by an animal, as I prefer to say too, don't understand it. And so that lack of understanding can lead to perhaps lack of support around people who are grieving a loss. And pet loss also encompasses not just the death of a pet, but of course, not knowing what happens to a pet if a pet is stolen or runs away. So there's a lot of different ways that a person can lose a pet as well. And there's not a lot of societal support around it. What do you say to a person who's experiencing a certain type of pet loss? How do you support the person? Sometimes people believe that, an animal can be replaced. Well, just like a person, that bond, that relationship is unique and it can never be replaced and it needs to be grieved.
So, Cheri, I think you bring up a lot of good points. I think even today, even though we've come so far, like you said, we have books, we have support groups, we have pet loss cards, which is amazing. But I think, people still do hear, oh, it was just a dog or it's just a cat, go and get another one. You never say that to someone who just lost a human child. But oftentimes our animals can feel like children, right? And so I think a form of even more disenfranchised grief is when we lose an animal that wasn't necessarily our own companion animal. So, for example, when you were working at the vet's office, you had to witness, maybe long-term patients die. Or if you work at a shelter, you're putting down numerous animals a day. Or if you're an animal rights activist, you're witnessing millions of animals being put to their death every single year. And so I think, society really doesn't understand, well, it wasn't even your animal. How can you be sad over a chicken? How can you be sad over a stray dog that you didn't even know? Right. And so let's talk about the grief process itself, because I think there are a lot of similarities in the grief process, whether this is your own companion animal or an animal that was in your care or an animal that you've been trying to protect. So can you describe the stages of grief and some of the symptoms that maybe people can expect when they go through this bereavement process?
I think one of the things that I wanted to address too, when you were talking about this, that popped up into my head was the fact that I think it's important to ask people what the loss means to them. We can never assume. A lot of time a pet may be like a child to a person, but also it may be a best friend, a constant companion. I've heard people describe it as my sister, my brother. So I think that is the first place we start with this when we start looking at grief and trying to help a person through. And then, in more general terms about people's life purpose of saving animals, of trying to, save that chicken, make sure that that pet is not experimented on, rescue those animals and that too. So there's different components at play that lead into the grief process. But if we're talking about stages and phases, and that we go back to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who outlined pretty predictable stages of grief that most people go through. And while she was applying it to, perhaps the loss of a person, and that, of course, we can liken it to the loss of pets as well very easily. I think the most important thing when we talk about these stages, though, is oftentimes because of the way they're laid out, we think that we go through grief in a linear fashion. So when I'm counseling someone, they may come in and say, oh, I've already been to denial and bargaining. I'm now feeling, real sadness, and I want to get to acceptance or resolution. Can you help me? And so it kind of lays it out in their mind like, okay, you're supposed to meet this one, that one, this one. And it's really not that way. It's more like a roller coaster ride, and you can go in and out of different stages or phases of grief. And then sometimes you may not even experience, all of them either. So perhaps someone doesn't, experience the, phases of guilt or bargaining or, even denial with it. But most often people do start at denial, and this can be when you're first told that your pet is going to die, or someone tells you that your pet died suddenly and unexpectedly. And it kind of cushions your mind against the full impact of the news that you're hearing. So it's not uncommon to be in the veterinary office and hear someone say, the doctor say, your pet's terminal. And the person say, should I schedule their teeth cleaning for next week? So that's a little bit of, they're trying to wrap their brain around the idea of losing their pet. Another stage, of course, is bargaining. You may bargain with yourself or a higher power for the life of the pet. If I buy only the best pet foods, if I pay more attention to him, could you please make it a different outcome? I will be the best, pet guardian, pet parent around. Do you want me to go through all the stages? I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I think that would be great for people that maybe, don't realize that there are some predictable stages.
Okay. And another one's guilt. That usually is not deserved. Oftentimes people, if, they lost their pet, it got hit by a car because they left the door or gate open, they may feel guilty about the loss. And when I'm working with someone, I usually say, well, what was your intention? Did you intend to leave the door open to let your pet out? Did you intend to leave the gate unlatched? And I think that's where we have to look, and that's what we have to look at when helping people through that. So usually guilt is something I hope people don't embrace because, again, it's usually never deserved. Then there's deep sadness or dysphoria. This is when people are very tearful over their loss of their pet. It's normal to grieve. It's normal to cry. It's normal to go through these feelings. We don't want to pathologize it. But at the same time, we want to recognize, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about that too, when someone's feeling deep sadness versus someone's going into a clinical depression. But predictable stage is to, cry and let the tears out and not hold them back and allow yourself to go through that process. And then the final one is, we call it acceptance or resolution. You accepted the loss. You're able to move forward again in your life. But I don't always love those terms, but what I think someone can get the feeling of it is that you're more often able at this point to remember life with your pet and feeling joy or smiling around it or feeling good about it. Or if you're, an animal rights worker, whatever, you're able to feel, empowered about what you do and good about what you do without feeling sadness most of the time.
Yeah, I think a lot of people worry that, well, if I let the tears go, it's like a dam that's going to break and I won't be able to make it stop. But the reality is the sorrow stage is actually the healing stage, correct?
Yeah, I think all of them, are healing in a sense if you need to go through them. But yes, letting your emotions out. I left that one too. Anger. It's okay to let out your anger too. People feel angry at a loss, but it can be therapeutic to do it. We just don't want to do it in a way that hurts somebody else or ourselves. But yeah, it's really important to give yourself room or safe space to do that. And that may be, something that's private for you. It may be something you do with someone who's close with you. It also, when you work through these feelings, it can even be something, where you work with someone like a therapist or go to a support group and, you're able to express those feelings. And I think, in the work that we do, it's so important for people to go to therapists, go to support groups, find that kind of support where people have an understanding about what it means to go through those things, those feelings, those emotions, and perhaps what the best way is to support someone through that process.
Yeah, because this really does deserve validation. This is regardless of what society says, this is a valid form of grief. And I wonder, do you think that animal caretakers run the risk of developing something more serious, such as compassion fatigue or clinical depression or even complicated grief, if they do kind of hold it back, if they don't allow themselves to grieve?
Most definitely. When you were talking about that, I was just thinking about there's a lot of shelters now that aren't quote unquote what we call kill shelters. They try not to euthanize, but there are quite a few of those still around and that too. And here in California, where I live, and this was many years ago, so things have changed a bit with this, but I was asked to come to the local Humane Society and work with some of the people in the shelter. And I spent the day with a young woman whose job it was to euthanize the animals that were there and whose time was up, that they didn't get adopted or had perhaps other medical challenges that weren't being addressed in that. And so I stood with her in this pretty kind of dark, dreary room with just a small window with some light filtered through it. And we sit at this table and she euthanized box after puppies, box after kittens, older dogs, younger cats. And she said something really profound to me. She said, I feel sometimes like taking the needle and plunging it into myself. But yeah, it's extremely concerning because this person, is expressing deep emotions that, even may have a red flag to them. I said, this is something, if you continue to do this, you see yourself doing that. So we had to address that issue, but asked her if there was, if she could do something else. And she said, actually, there's only two people that euthanize the pets. So she said, it's better for me to do this than to have them die some other way. And my recommendations later on was to rotate people throughout the Humane Society and put them in adoptions for a while and see, more positive side of that. And so I think if you're going through that and you're having those feelings, you need to recognize, you need to be cognizant of the fact that you need to take a step back and you need to spend some time, which we call as therapists, upstream, doing something that makes you feel better. So even if you feel like you're fulfilling a meaning and purpose that's important to you, you also have to recognize that you have feelings around this too, and you need to care for yourself around those feelings.
Yeah, I mean, grief is just absolutely exhausting on the mind, body, and soul. And so I think self-care is so important. And you bring up a really good point with, wanting to or kind of fantasizing about, plunging the needle into your own vein, which I'll be quite honest, I've been there, people. And we have lost people who have done that, which is why this is just so important that we talk about this. So I think that having suicidal feelings is definitely a symptom of complicated grief. So that's not what we call quote unquote normal grief. What are some other symptoms of complicated grief? What should people be on the lookout for?
Well, suicide is a way of a person taking themselves out of pain, but there's better solutions because suicide is a permanent solution. So you need to try some other things first. But when we talk about looking at this, person needs to see if they're falling into what we call clinical depression. And that can include sleep disturbances, appetite changes, eating too much or too little, kind of down regulating without, being able to sleep, or sleeping too much, feelings of anxiety, constant worry. Any of these things are, red flags where you need to get yourself to someone who can help you with it, because clinical depression is not something you can just work through on your own. You need to work through it with a doctor, a therapist, someone who is skilled at recognizing that you're in this place and can try different forms of treatment to help you get out of this place.
And so what advice would you have for people as far as grieving to avoid risking complicated grief or depression? What's a healthy, quote unquote, healthy way to grieve?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think when we first look at this, we can talk about what's not a good way to grieve. Culturally or in our society, oftentimes we'll say, come have a drink, we'll cheer you up. Alcohol may cheer you up for the short term, but in the long term, you end up, down regulating, spiral down. You feel worse. You feel, more depressed afterwards. Any kind of, mood altering substances that perhaps you're just taking to try to feel good on your own can actually, tend to complicate the grief and the mourning process. Healthy things to do for yourself is to, for a time, don't associate with people who can't understand what you're going through or don't want to understand or can't relate, I should say, to what you're going through. You don't need to be around people who are making comments that, even if well-intended, tend to hurt. And usually people know who those, people are in their lives. Spend time with people who understand what it's like to experience those feelings, for the loss of a pet. There's no right or wrong way to go through the process with it. But again, doing things that kind of normalize your grief which would just be following day-to-day routines. Even if you don't feel like doing it, it's important to try to follow the routine as much as possible. Instead of isolating, try to engage or put yourself with people, like even in a pet loss support group or that, who understand what you're going through. And there's different types of groups. There's groups for people who are in the veterinary medical field, or who are perhaps rescue workers, then of course people who are pet parents, and that too. So you can usually find a space where people are understanding what you're going through. Most of us don't even feel like this when we're in a good mood. Well, at least I'm speaking for myself. There are people who love it though. Exercise. So exercise can, help elevate that mood, get you out into nature, perhaps ideally, do it outside, take your mind to a little bit different place. And then of course, we never know when those tears are going to pop up, and it's okay to let them go. There are people who may be standing next to you who are strangers, in the grocery store line, and you see someone holding a bag of pet food or something, and your eyes well with tears. And, more likely than not, because they're buying that bag of pet food, they understand what it's like to go through a loss too. So I think allowing, yourself to have these emotions and these feelings too actually help you to go through it quicker, without a lot of bumps and bruises and scrapes. If you try to push it away, self-medicate it away, ignore it, or isolate yourself with the grief and loss.
So it sounds like the only way through is through.
Yeah, I think Thoreau said that the best way out is always through. And so
Yeah.
I have that quote framed somewhere, and it's like, we don't want to go through grief. We usually feel like we're kicking and screaming and dragging ourselves and pushing it away, because that's the downside to loving animals. And oftentimes they don't have lifespans like we do. And so we're going through a lot of loss. And I think it's particularly important to acknowledge this with kids and help establish a healthy foundation for them as well, because our life is about moving towards something, an exciting, positive way often. And then oftentimes we have to let go of things, too, when we do that. And so when we embrace a new animal, when we love a new animal, at some point we're going to have to say goodbye to that relationship. And that's something, we don't ever want to do. And sometimes people tell me at group, I am never going to love an animal again. It hurts too bad. But more often than not, people come back and they often say, could you come out to the car? I just want to show you something. And they have their pet who they'll say, well, I didn't seek this pet out. It found me. And I said, oh, you got adopted. So that's how it works. I think when, animals know that we love them, somehow they find us, and we're kind of in this symbiotic relationship but we do get our hearts broken. And that's the downside to the effects of it, whether we're going to have pets, as close companions, or we're going to be doing work with animals, or, too. It's our hearts do get broken with this.
I think everyone has a very unique way of grieving, and everyone has a unique way that maybe they can honor, whether it's a pet that they've lost or an animal that they've cared for and worked for that they've lost. So I used to work with a girl who every time she had to perform euthanasia, she would go home and light a candle for each animal that she had to put down that day. I've worked with other people that have gotten a tattoo that honors their animal. I went back to grad school and got a master's degree to honor my pet. So I think there's a lot of different things that we can do to honor those losses. What other advice do you have? What are some other unique or creative ways to honor the animals that we've lost in our lives?
Well, the ones that you spoke of were ones that I've definitely heard of with people. I think we can look at big ways, and we can also look at just the everyday way too. As long as we are alive, we can share the story of our loved ones with other people. We can talk about what our pet meant to us, who they were, what they did, share those stories. And in doing so, you keep those memories alive, but you also honor your pet and the life that you shared by sharing those memories. I knew someone who built a shrine on their property out here to their pet. People who put together scrapbooks or website memorials so family members could visit and see pictures of the pets as well, or make comments on them. Do something in the name of your pet for other animals. Dedicate yourself, perhaps your life to working in honor of your pet, trying to help other animals. So not all of us, have the time or inclination to do that or go back to school and get a master's degree to be able to do that. But I dedicated my first book to Wendell, my rabbit, who died, as I said, while I was working on my master's thesis. And I think you just have to do what feels right for yourself, what feels good. Sometimes people make a donation to the Humane Society or other organizations in their pet's memory. There's so many things that you can do. My husband's a veterinarian. I have had 3 children. And as you can just imagine, I have had a plethora of pets throughout my lifetime come through my home. And we have a special tree in our yard. We bury them under, we have them cremated, and then we bury their ashes under. And that was real important because we had planted the tree when my daughter was born. And I shared with her story about how, the trees take nourishment and that. And of course, when we started losing our pets and burying them under the tree, we talked about the pets becoming part of that process, part of that life cycle. And the interesting thing about this tree was that it never bloomed. It was alive, but it didn't start to bloom until we started burying our pets. And it's
wow.
a huge, beautiful tree in our yard many, many years later. And we still do this process. So, it just came to life in that circle of life, teaching that. So it can be something like that for you. It's just what helps you to feel good about it. I know a lot of times people go into rescue work or volunteer work out of the love of their animal or working with people who experience loss of their pets. They want to pay that forward and help give them some support around it too.
Yeah, so Cheri, what is the best way for people to learn more about you, your support group, or even your books?
You can get my books through any bookstore, but probably the best way would be to go to my author's page on Amazon.com. And you would see it all pop up there. And usually I ask people to directly contact me about the Pet Loss Support Group. I do have Pet Bereavement page on Facebook that people can look up and get information about that as well. And then, of course, email me at cherybross@aol.com. And I usually directly respond to people. In fact, I've had the honor of helping to create Pet Loss Support Group throughout the world. So most recently, I had been helping someone in Great Britain for that. So it's kind of wonderful for me to see all of this, like dropping a pebble into a pond and all this ripple effect. And my hope is for one day to not have pet loss as, an unrecognized loss, that it's something that most people understand what it means to love a pet and experience that love in return, and what is experienced with the loss of a pet as well.
Absolutely, Cheri. And I thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise. And I hope that this conversation is yet one more little pebble in that pond, and just spreading the word that, guys, this is normal. It's healthy to grieve the loss of a pet. It's healthy to grieve the loss of an animal that we're trying to protect. And I'm going to have links to all the resources that Cheri mentioned. I'll put those up at the show notes page at the CompassionFatiguePodcast.com. So if you're out and about and want to check out those resources later, I'll have those posted for you. Cheri, thanks again for all your work and for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you for everything that you do.
All right. Take care.
Take care, you too. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Compassion Fatigue Podcast. Check out the CompassionFatiguePodcast.com for a link to join our private Facebook group where starting next week I'll be featuring Memorial Mondays, where you can join me and post photos of your friends who have crossed over the Rainbow Bridge. Please note that this podcast is not meant to provide medical advice or substitute for psychological care. Please consult with a mental health professional if you need additional support, and if you are feeling suicidal, please go to your nearest emergency room or call 911.